A new captain takes command of a company and starts learning how everything operates. One day, he notices two soldiers standing guard over an old bench in the middle of the courtyard. Curious, he asks his sergeants, "Why are we guarding this bench?" They shrug. It's just always been that way. The previous commander ordered it. So the captain calls the previous commander, now a major. "Sir, why did you order guards on that bench?" The major replies, "I don't know. That was already in place when I took over. The commander before me set that up." The captain keeps digging. He calls that commander, now a lieutenant colonel. Same answer. "It was passed down from my predecessor." This goes on a couple more times. Each officer kicks the can further up the chain until finally the captain tracks down a retired four-star general who led the unit decades ago. The captain respectfully asks, "Sir, do you remember why you ordered a guard on that bench?" The general pauses for a moment, then bursts out laughing. "Wait, are they still guarding that thing?" he says. "I only put those guards there because the paint was wet." A blonde woman got tired of all the jokes about blondes not being smart. She wanted to prove to her husband that blondes can be clever too. One day, while her husband was at work, she decided to paint a couple of rooms in the house. The next afternoon, her husband came home early and smelled the fresh paint right away. He found his wife lying on the floor, sweating and wearing a ski jacket over a fur coat. Concerned, he asked, "Are you okay?" She smiled and said, "I'm fine. I just wanted to show you that blondes can be smart by painting the house." He asked, "But why are you wearing a ski jacket over your fur coat?" She answered confidently, "Because the paint can said, for best results, apply 2 coats." An explorer stumbles into a hidden ancient tomb. Right in the center, he finds an old, dusty lamp. Of course, he picks it up and gives it a rub. Poof! A genie appears, but not just any genie. "I'm a cursed genie," he says. "I'll grant you 3 wishes, but whatever you wish for, your ex-wife will get double." The explorer doesn't flinch. "I wish for $1 billion. Granted. Your ex-wife now has $2 billion. I want a mansion in California with a pool, tennis courts, everything. Done. She gets 2. Then the genie says, "Now your 3rd and final wish?" The explorer walks away, thinks for a moment, then returns holding a stick. He looks the genie straight in the eye and says, "See this stick? I want you to give me a solid beating, just enough, so she gets double." At the wedding rehearsal, the groom pulls the pastor aside and makes a bold offer. "Here's $100, he whispers. "When we get to the vows, skip the part where I have to love, honor and obey, or promise to be faithful forever. Just leave that out, all right?" The pastor nods and pockets the cash, and the groom walks away feeling pretty clever. Fast forward to the big day. The church is full. The bride is glowing. The groom stands proudly at the altar. Then the pastor turns to him and says, "Do you promise to prostrate yourself before her, obey her every command, serve her breakfast in bed every morning, and swear before God and this entire room that you will never so much as glance at another woman for as long as you both shall live?" The groom's eyes go wide. He swallows hard. "Yes," he squeaks. As they step aside, the groom leans in and hisses, "I thought we had a deal." The pastor slips a crisp $100 into his palm and whispers back, "She made me a better offer." A Chinese man was sitting at the bar when a Jewish man came up and punched him in the nose. He grabs his nose and says, "What was that for?" The Jewish man says, "That's for Pearl Harbor." The Chinese man exclaims, "Pearl Harbor? I'm Chinese! That was the Japanese!" To which the Jewish man replies, "Chinese, Vietnamese, Japanese. They're all the same." The Chinese man sits at the bar, getting angrier and angrier. Finally, he can take no more and goes and punches the Jewish man in his nose and says, "That's for the Titanic." The Jewish man is puzzled. "The Titanic? Goldberg, Steinberg, iceberg, they're all the same," replies the Chinese man. 2 women friends had gone out for a girls' night out and had been over-enthusiastic on the cocktails. Incredibly drunk and walking home, they suddenly realized they both needed to pee. They were very close to a graveyard, and one of them suggested they do their business behind a headstone or something. The first woman had nothing to wipe with, so she took off her panties, used them, and threw them away. Her friend, however, was wearing an expensive underwear set and didn't want to ruin hers, but was lucky enough to salvage a large ribbon from a wreath that was on a grave and proceeded to wipe herself with it. After finishing, they made their way home. The next day, the first woman's husband phones the other husband and says, "These girls' nights out have got to stop. My wife came home last night without her panties." "That's nothing," said the other. "Mine came back with a sympathy card stuck between the cheeks of her backside that said, 'From all of us at the fire station, we'll never forget you.'" A blonde calls her boyfriend and says, "Please come over here and help me. I have a killer jigsaw puzzle and I can't figure out how to get started." Her boyfriend asks, "What is it supposed to be when it's finished?" The blonde says, "According to the picture on the box, it's a rooster." Her boyfriend decides to go over and help with the puzzle. She lets him in and shows him where she has the puzzle spread all over the table. He studies the pieces for a moment, then looks at the box, then turns to her and says, "First of all, no matter what we do, we're not going to be able to assemble these pieces into anything resembling a rooster." He then takes her hand and says, "Secondly, I want you to relax. Let's have a nice cup of tea, and then," he said with a deep sigh, "let's put all these cornflakes back in the box." An attractive young woman on a flight from Ireland asked the priest beside her, "Father, may I ask a favor?" "Of course, child. What may I do for you?" "Well, I bought my mother an expensive hairdryer for her birthday. It is unopened but well over the customs limits, and I'm afraid they'll confiscate it. Is there any way you could carry it through customs for me? Hide it under your robes, perhaps?" "I would love to help you, dear, but I must warn you, I will not lie." "With your honest face, Father, no one will question you," she replied. When they got to customs, she let the priest go first. The official asked, "Father, do you have anything to declare?" "From the top of my head down to my waist, I have nothing to declare." The official thought this answer strange, so he asked, "And what do you have to declare from your waist to the floor?" Father replied, "I have a marvelous instrument designed to be used on a woman, which is, to date, unused." Roaring with laughter, the official said, "Go ahead, Father. Next, please." The flight wasn't carrying enough meals for all passengers. Airborne less than 30 minutes on an outbound evening flight, the stew-led flight attendant for the cabin crew nervously made the following painful announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so very sorry, but it appears that there has been a terrible last-minute error by our airport catering service. I don't know how this has happened, but we have 103 passengers on board and, unfortunately, only 40 dinner meals. I truly apologize for this mistake and inconvenience." When the passenger muttering had died down, she continued, "Anyone who is kind enough to give up their meal so that someone else can eat will receive free, unlimited drinks for the duration of our flight." Her next announcement came 90 minutes later. "If anyone would like to change their minds, we still have 40 dinners available." A blind pilot walks into a plane waving his walking stick. The passengers all look at each other in disbelief. The flight attendant gets on the PA and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the captain is legally blind. But rest assured, he is one of the best pilots in the world with over 6,000 successful flights." Next, the co-pilot makes his way to the plane, and he is also blind and uses his walking stick to make it to the cabin. The flight attendant gets on the PA and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the co-pilot is also blind, but rest assured, he is the second best pilot in the world with over 5,000 successful flights." At this point, the plane begins to take off from the runway. As it gains speed, the passengers grow tenser. The plane keeps accelerating more and more, and as it approaches the end of the runway, it still hasn't left the ground. The plane is approaching the end of the runway at high speed, and the passengers scream, "Oh my God, we're all going to die!" Suddenly, the plane takes off and begins its ascent. The pilot turns to the co-pilot and says, "The day they stop screaming, we're screwed." A photographer from a well-known national magazine was assigned to cover the fires at Yellowstone National Park. The magazine wanted to show some of the heroic work of the firefighters as they battled the blaze. When the photographer arrived, he realized that the smoke was so thick that it would seriously impede or make it impossible for him to photograph anything from ground level. He requested permission to rent a plane and take photos from the air. His request was approved and arrangements were made. He was told to report to a nearby airport where a plane would be waiting for him. He arrived at the airport and saw a plane warming up near the gate. He jumped in with his bag and shouted, "Let's go!" The pilot swung the little plane into the wind, and within minutes they were in the air. The photographer said, "Fly over the park and make 2 or 3 low passes so I can take some pictures." "Why?" asked the pilot. "Because I am a photographer," he responded, "and photographers take photographs." The pilot was silent for a moment. Finally, he stammered, "You mean you're not the flight instructor?" There were 2 brothers who lived in the country. One day they decided they wanted to move to the big city and get jobs there. When they got there, they went to the employment office to ask for jobs. The first brother went in for an interview, and less than 10 minutes later, he came out of the office jumping for joy, yelling, "Hooey, I got a job!" The second brother was so happy and excited for what he would get. He enters the office, and the interviewer asks him what his skills are. "Well," he says, "I can cut and split wood like crazy." The interviewer looks at him and says, well, it's going to be hard to find a job in this city with those skills. Everything in the city is steel and concrete. We don't have much use for a woodcutter." Disheartened, the second brother says, "But my brother was just in here and he got a job." The interviewer says, "Yes, but he says he can pilot, and that's a valuable skill." The brother sits up in his chair and says, "That may be so, but he can't pilot till I cut it." A despondent young woman who had lost her job and her house had decided to commit suicide. She was walking along a bridge across the harbor, getting the nerve to jump in, when a young man saw her. "Don't do it," he called out. He looked at her and realized she was incredibly beautiful. He came closer. "What's wrong?" he asked. The woman told him. "Okay, here's the thing," he said. "I'm a crew member on a ship that leaves for Europe tomorrow morning. How about you come with me on the ship? I'll bring you food and drink." He slid his arm around her. "I keep you happy. You keep me happy." She agreed. After all, there wasn't much else to do. She didn't have family. The man was quite handsome as well. No harm in trying. The next morning, he hid her in one of the lifeboats on the ship with a pillow and a blanket. Every night, he brought her 3 sandwiches and a piece of fruit, and they made love until dawn. One day, about a week after the affair started, the captain was doing his rounds and found her inside one of the lifeboats. "What the hell are you doing here?" She explained what was going on. "I get food and a trip to Europe, and he gets to screw me." "He sure does, sweetheart. This is the Sydney Harbor ferry." A lady about 8 months pregnant got on a bus. She noticed the man opposite her was smiling at her. She immediately moved to another seat. This time, the smile turned into a grin, so she moved again. The man seemed more amused, and each time she switched seats, the man got increasingly amused. When on the 4th move, the man burst out laughing. She complained to the driver, and he had the man arrested. The case came up in court. The judge asked the man, about 20 years old, what he had to say for himself. The young man replied, "Well, Your Honor, it was like this. When the lady got on the bus, I couldn't help but notice her condition. She sat down under a sign that said, 'The double mint twins are coming,' and I grinned. Then she moved and sat under a sign that said, 'Logan's liniment will reduce the swelling,' and I had to smile. Then she placed herself under a deodorant sign that said, 'William's big stick did the trick,' and I could hardly contain myself. But, Your Honor, when she moved the 4th time and sat under a sign that said, 'Goodyear rubber could have prevented this accident,' I just lost it. Case dismissed." A guy driving a Kia pulls up at a stoplight next to a Rolls-Royce. The driver of the Kia rolls down his window and shouts to the driver of the Rolls, "Hey, buddy, that's a nice car. You got Wi-Fi in your Rolls? I've got Wi-Fi in my Kia." The driver of the Rolls looks over and says simply, "Yes, I have Wi-Fi." The driver of the Kia says, "Cool. Hey, you got a fridge in there too? I've got a fridge in the backseat of my Kia." The driver of the Rolls, looking annoyed, says, "Yes, I have a refrigerator." The driver of the Kia says, "That's great, man. "Hey, you got a TV in there too. You know, I got a TV in the back seat of my Kia." The driver of the Rolls, looking very annoyed by now, says, "Yes, I have a television. A Rolls-Royce is the finest luxury car in the world." The driver of the Kia says, "That's a very cool car. Hey, you got a bed in there too? I got a bed in the back of my Kia." Upset that he did not have a bed, the driver of the Rolls-Royce sped away. He went straight to the dealer, where he promptly ordered that a bed be installed in the back of the Rolls. The next morning, the driver of the Rolls picked up his car. The bed looked superb, complete with silk sheets and brass trim. It was clearly a bed fit for a Rolls-Royce. So the driver of the Rolls drove around all day looking for the Kia. Finally, late that night, he finds the Kia parked with all the windows fogged up from the inside. The driver of the Rolls gets out of his car and knocks on the Kia's window. At first, there is no answer. Then the owner sticks his head out, soaking wet. "I now have a bed in the back of my Rolls-Royce," the driver of the Rolls said arrogantly. The driver of the Kia says, "You got me out of the shower to tell me that?" A woman seated while flying in economy and holding her baby in her arms was startled when the man sitting behind her bent forward to say, "Ma'am, that is one ugly baby you have there." The woman, wide-eyed and open-mouthed, was so shocked she could barely retort, "Well, I never—" The man continued, "I'm just being honest with you, ma'am. I mean, I've seen some ugly babies in my time, but yours is a real showstopper." Quite overwhelmed, the woman called a flight attendant over. "The man behind me just hurled the most hideous insult at me, and I demand to be moved to a different seat," she said. The attendant gave her a consoling look of sympathy. "I'm so sorry, but as you know, our flight is fully booked, and until we find someone willing to switch seats, I'm afraid I won't be able to reseat you. We do apologize, however, and if you like, in the meantime, we'd be happy to offer you anything from our in-flight menu free of charge." "Fine," the woman said with an air of resignation, "but I've never been so insulted in all my life. What a horrible man." "Well, I just said the truth," could be faintly heard from the seat behind. Hearing that, the attendant resolved to make the woman feel better as soon as possible, telling her, "Any item of food or any alcoholic or non-alcoholic beverage, whatever you choose, it's on us," she said, "and if you like, I'll also bring a banana for your comfort monkey." A gorilla goes into a bar and orders a martini. This totally amazes the bartender, but he thinks, "What the heck, I guess I might as well make the drink." So he mixes the martini. He then walks back over to give it to the gorilla, and the animal is holding out a $20 bill. Well, now the bartender is just at a loss for words. He can't believe that a gorilla walked into his bar, ordered a martini, and then actually had a $20 bill to pay for it. So, in amazement, he takes the 20 and walks to the cash register to make the change. While he's standing in front of the cash register, he stops for a second and thinks to himself, "Let me try something here and see if the gorilla notices anything." So he walks back over to the gorilla and hands him $1 in change. The gorilla doesn't say anything. He just sits there, sipping the martini. After a few minutes, the bartender just can't take it anymore. "You know," he says to the gorilla, "we don't get too many gorillas in here." And the gorilla says, "At $19 a drink, I'm not surprised." A Texan walks into a bar in Ireland and clears his voice to address the crowd of drinkers. He says, "I hear you Irish are damn good drinkers. I'll bet $500 American to anybody in here who can drink 10 pints of Guinness back to back." The room is quiet, and no one takes up the Texan's offer. One man even leaves. 30 minutes later, the same gentleman who left shows back up and taps the Texan on the shoulder. "Is your bet still good?" asks the Irishman. The Texan says yes and asks the bartender to line up 10 pints of Guinness. Immediately, the Irishman tears into the pint glasses, drinking them all back to back. The other patrons cheer as the Texan watches in amazement. The Texan gives the Irishman his money and says, "If you don't mind me asking, where did you go for the past 30 minutes? The Irishman replies, "Oh, I had to go to the pub down the street to see if I could do it first." A Scotsman, an Englishman, and an Irishman walk into a bar. Sitting in a bar, the Scotsman says, "As good as this bar is, I still prefer the pubs back home." In Glasgow, there's a wee place. The landlord goes out of his way for the locals. When you buy 4 drinks, he'll buy the 5th drink. Well, said the Englishman, at my local in London, the barman will buy you your 3rd drink after you buy the first 2. Ah, that's nothing, said the Irishman. Back home in my favorite pub, the moment you set foot in the place, they'll buy you a drink, then another, all the drinks you like, actually. Then when you've had enough drinks, they'll take you upstairs and see that you get laid all on the house. The Englishman and Scotsman were suspicious of the claims. The Irishman swore every word was true. Then the Englishman asked, "Did this actually happen to you?" "Not to me personally, no," admitted the Irishman. "But it did happen to me sister quite a few times." A blonde, a brunette, and a redhead walk into a restaurant. They are having a fun time and give their waitress a huge tip. Super excited about the tip, the waitress decides to tell them a secret. In the women's bathroom, there is a magical mirror. If you tell it something truthful, you will be greatly rewarded. However, if you lie to the mirror, you will disappear in a poof. Excited to try this mirror out, the women rush to the restroom. The brunette decides to show off and claim she is the most beautiful girl there. "I think I'm the most beautiful person at this restaurant." $1 million appears in her hands. The redhead is feeling a little offended. She decides to show off how smart she is. "I think I'm the smartest person in this restaurant." The keys to a Lamborghini magically show up in her purse. The blonde, super excited to get something really cool, starts to tell the mirror something. "I think," oh, poof, she is never seen again. A sign on a restaurant window says, "If you order it and we don't have it, you instantly win $1 million. A man walking by notices the sign and walks in the restaurant and sits down at the table with a smirk on his face. The waiter asks what he will be having, and the man says, "I will have white rhinoceros stew, please." The waiter comes out with a boiling hot bowl of exactly what the man ordered. The man is taken by surprise, but he eats the stew and pays for his very expensive meal. He leaves angrily. The next day he comes back and sits at the table with a smirk on his face again. He tells the waiter, "Today I will have bullet ants stuffed with dolphin meat." The waiter leaves and quickly comes back after a few minutes with exactly what the man ordered. The man, surprised again, eats his meal angrily, pays and leaves. The next day he comes back and sits at the table and tells the waiter, "Today I will have a lactating mermaid breast sandwich." A few minutes go by, and the waiter comes out holding 2 massive duffel bags with the $1 million. The man, overcome with excitement, says, "I knew it. You don't have mermaid breasts." The waiter tells him politely, "We actually have it, sir. It's just that we ran out of bread." 2 men are walking their dogs, a Doberman and a Chihuahua, when they see a restaurant. They're pretty hungry, so they decide to head in for a bite to eat. Unfortunately, they see a sign out front that says, "No dogs allowed." The man with the Doberman says, "I know what to do, just follow my lead." He throws on a pair of sunglasses and walks in. The waiter tells him, "I'm sorry, sir, we don't allow dogs here." The man says, "Oh, you don't understand, I'm blind and this is my guide dog." "A Doberman for a guide dog?" the waiter asks, skeptical. "Yes," the man replies. "Dobermans are very loyal. They're easy to train and protective, too. They're born for the job." The waiter sighs and leads the man to a table. The second man, excited by this idea, throws on his sunglasses and walks in. The waiter tells him, "I'm sorry, sir. We don't allow dogs here." The man says, "Oh, you don't understand. I'm blind, and this is my guide dog." "A Chihuahua for a guide dog?" the waiter asks. "A Chihuahua?" the man asks. "They gave me a Chihuahua." Bert, at 75 years old, always wanted a pair of soft spike golf shoes like Freddie Couples. So seeing some on sale after his round, he bought them, and he was so delighted with his purchase, decided to wear them home to show the missus. Walking proudly into the house, he sauntered into the kitchen and said to his wife, "Notice anything different about me?" Margaret, at age 73, looked him over and replied, "Nope." Frustrated as all get out, Bert stormed off into the bathroom, undressed, and walked back into the kitchen completely naked, except for the new golf shoes. Again, he asked Margaret, a little louder this time, "Notice anything different now?" Margaret looked up and said in her best deadpan response, "Bert, what's different? It's hanging down today, it was hanging down yesterday, and it'll be hanging down again tomorrow." Furious, Bert yells out, "And do you know why it's hanging down, Margaret?" "Nope, not a clue," she replied. "It's hanging down because it's looking at my new golf shoes." Without missing a beat, Margaret replies, "Should have bought a new golf hat, Bert." A shepherd is tending his flock in a remote pasture when suddenly a shiny red BMW appears. The driver is a young man in an Armani suit, Ferragamo shoes, and polarized sunglasses. He sticks his head out the window and asks the shepherd, "Hey, if I can tell you how many sheep you have in your flock, will you give me one?" The shepherd looks at him and agrees. The driver plugs his cell phone into a laptop and connects it to a GPS and starts a remote body heat scan of the area. During the process, he sends some emails. After receiving the answers, he prints a 100-page report on the portable printer in his glove compartment and proudly announces to the shepherd, "You have exactly 1,478 sheep," to which the shepherd answers, "Impressive. You can choose one sheep out of my flock." He observes the man pick up an animal and load it into his car. Then the shepherd says, "If I can tell you exactly what your business is, will you give me back my animal?" "You're on." The young man answers, "You are a McKinsey consultant," says the shepherd promptly. "You are right. How could you possibly guess?" says the man, visibly surprised. "It wasn't a guess," the shepherd replies. "You drive into my field uninvited. You want me to pay you for a piece of information I already know. You answer questions I haven't asked, and you know nothing about my business. Now give me back my dog." One day, a blonde woman was sentenced to death, and as the judge prepared to pass the final order, he looked at her and said, "Do you have any last wishes?" The blonde thought for a moment, then looked up at him with a hopeful smile and said, "Actually, yes, Judge. Could you, hang in my place?" A man is in his boat out on the lake with a bucket full of fish that he had just caught. A wildlife officer spots him and pulls his boat up alongside. Seeing the bucket of fish in the man's boat, the wildlife officer asks to see his fishing license. The man tells the officer that he doesn't need a fishing license. The wildlife officer looks down at the bucket and says, "You definitely need a license to be catching fish. I can see that you've been fishing today. You have live fish right there." The man says, "Oh no, those are my pet fish. I just brought them out here for the day to enjoy the lake." "Pet fish," replied the wildlife officer. "Oh, absolutely. I let him out of the bucket and they swim around and play, but when I whistle, they all jump right back in. They are very well trained." The wildlife officer scratches his chin, then says, "I've never heard such a... Well, I've got to see this." The man dumps the bucket of fish into the lake, then calmly turns and looks at the wildlife officer. The wildlife officer says, "Well, call them back." The man says, "Call who back?" The wildlife officer says, "Your pet fish." "What fish?" replied the man. A blonde wanted to try out ice fishing. She went out and purchased all the gear she would need and headed to a local spot to try to catch some fish. She went out onto the ice with her gear, and after getting comfy on the stool, she started to cut a circular hole in the ice as she had seen on the internet. As she was cutting, she heard a voice from the heavens speak out, saying, "There are no fish under the ice." The blonde was startled. She stood up and looked around but saw no one. Cautiously, she moved a little further out onto the ice and set up in a different spot. She sipped some hot chocolate from her thermos and then started cutting another hole. Again, the voice called out, seemingly from all around her, "There are no fish under the ice." Now feeling quite scared and starting to get a bit frustrated, she moved all the way to the far end of the ice and laid out all her gear, sat upon her stool and started cutting another hole. Right away, the heavenly voice boomed out, this time louder than ever, "There are no fish under the ice!" She jumped off her stool and looked all around her. She shouted to the heavens, "Is that you, Lord?" The voice answered, "No, this is the manager of the ice skating rink. There are no fish under the ice." A man lays sprawled across 3 entire seats at a posh theater. Before the show has even started, an usher walks by and notices the man. "Sir, you're only allowed one seat. Can you please sit up?" The man groans but stays where he is. The usher, becoming impatient with the man, says, "Sir, if you don't get up, I will need to get my manager involved." Again, the man just groans, which infuriates the usher, as he marches off to get the manager. In a few moments, he returns with the manager, and they both repeatedly attempt to move him, but with no success. It was at this point that the manager calls the police. Moments later, a police officer arrives and approaches the man. "All right, buddy, what's your name?" "Sam," the man moans. "And where you from, Sam?" With pain in his voice, Sam replied, "The balcony."